Chosen ones, someone is on their knees right now begging for mercy, and if that sentence stirred something in your spirit, it is not by accident. They're praying harder than they have ever prayed before, calling on God with trembling hands and desperate tears. But here is the truth they cannot rewrite. When heaven whispered warnings, they laughed. When discernment knocked, they mocked. When they were told to stop, they accelerated. This is not bad luck circling back, not random misfortune, not coincidence lining up in an unfortunate sequence. This is divine consequence unfolding with precision for attacking what God Himself ordained. And while they were entangling themselves in plans they thought were clever, you were minding your business, building, healing, preparing, aligning. You were not pacing the floor, plotting revenge. You were not obsessing over enemies. You were doing the work, and because you stayed focused on your destiny instead of their drama, you are now in a position to see clearly what truly happened behind the scenes. Stay with me, because what you're about to understand will close chapters of confusion, release lingering doubt, and anchor you deeper into your identity as someone who is divinely protected. If this message confirms what your spirit has already sensed, engage with it, let it circulate so other chosen ones who have felt unexplained resistance can recognize they were never crazy and never alone. You're about to see that while you were building your future in faith, forces were at work both for you and against you, and heaven has already responded. The warning they mocked did not come in chaos or ambiguity. It came through someone who could see beyond the visible, someone attuned to spiritual currents and consequences, someone who looked them directly in the eye and said with clarity that what they were attempting would not end well, that they were crossing a line that once crossed could not simply be stepped back over as if it was chalk on pavement. Stop now or face irreversible consequences was not dramatic flair, it was law, being stated plainly. But arrogance has a way of blinding people to mercy when mercy is still available. They heard the warning, and instead of feeling conviction, they felt insulted instead of humility. They felt challenged, and pride rose up like a shield that convinced them they were above correction. They laughed, dismissed it, and doubled down, convincing themselves that power was something they could manipulate, and that consequences were something that only happened to other people. What they fail to understand is that spirit does not negotiate with those who weaponize darkness against the anointed. There are rules woven into the fabric of the universe that do not bend for ego, and one of those rules is simple. You cannot knowingly attack what is divinely commissioned and expect neutrality in response. They were told clearly that what they were attempting would backfire, that it would not just fail but reverse. Yet jealousy whispered louder than wisdom. They mistook warning for intimidation and caution for weakness. They believed that because they had gotten away with lesser manipulations before, this would be no different. But you were not a random target. You were not unguarded territory. You were and are under assignment, and assignment activates protection. The message they ignored was not superstition, it was structure. It was a reminder that certain lines are not suggestions, they are boundaries guarded by forces far beyond human influence. When people choose to ignore a warning that is given in clarity, they are not just choosing risk, they are choosing accountability. And accountability does not disappear simply because someone regrets their choice later. That is the weight of what they are now discovering. The hidden plot that unfolded while you were building did not begin in chaos. It began in observation. While you were peacefully progressing, minding your business, focusing on growth, someone was watching. They were watching your elevation, your resilience, your quiet confidence, and instead of being inspired, they felt threatened. While you slept, they were awake rehearsing scenarios in their mind about your downfall. While you prayed for alignment, they strategized interference. They did not limit themselves to fleeting negative thoughts. They gathered others, forming a small circle, convincing themselves that numbers equaled power. 3 people can become an echo chamber of delusion when envy is the common language. They fed off each other's resentment, amplifying suspicion into certainty and insecurity into action. It was coordinated in their minds, deliberate in their conversations, and fueled by the belief that if they concentrated enough intention, they could shift outcomes that were already sealed in heavenly courts long before they ever recognized your name. Their motivation was not random hatred, it was envy sharpened by proximity. They saw your light, and instead of tending to their own darkness, they decided to try to extinguish yours. They felt your progress and interpreted it as their loss. Most of all, they sensed something forming around you, a union, a partnership, a merging of paths that would amplify your impact, and that future unsettled them. They did not just want to see you stumble, they wanted to prevent you from stepping fully into what was waiting. Envy of your light and hatred of your progress became the fuel for their coordination. They convinced themselves that if they could introduce confusion, delay, and doubt into your path, you would sabotage yourself and walk away from blessings that were never meant to be optional. What they never factored in was that while they were gathering in secrecy, you were covered in visibility from the spiritual realm. Every whispered strategy was overheard by forces assigned to you. Every intention sent in your direction encountered a barrier they could not perceive. And even though you may have felt moments of heaviness or resistance, you were never abandoned in that season. You were being defended while you were developing. You were being shielded while you were strengthening. They thought they were operating unseen, but there is no shadow deep enough to conceal action from a universe that keeps perfect record. And now, as consequences unfold and desperation replaces arrogance, you can stand in the calm assurance that you did not have to fight this battle manually. You stayed focused, you kept building, you kept believing, and the very destiny they tried to interrupt is still intact, still protected, still moving forward with greater momentum than before. The reason the attack was a mistake is not rooted in your ego or superiority. It is rooted in a law older than their envy and stronger than their coordination. And that law is simple. You're under divine protection whether you feel it every second or not. Protection does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it looks like redirection delay or quiet resilience. But make no mistake, your life is not random terrain. Your assignments are heaven-ordained, written into the architecture of your soul before you ever took your first breath. The connections forming around you are not coincidences strung together by chance. They are divinely orchestrated intersections of timing, growth, and purpose. When someone chooses to attack a person under assignment, they are not simply challenging an individual personality. They're stepping into conflict with the design itself, and design is defended by the designer. This is where their calculation failed. They believed they were dealing with your personality, your emotions, your human limitations. They thought if they could destabilize you mentally or energetically, they could derail your path. But your path is not self-manufactured ambition alone. It is a corridor carved through resistance by intention far beyond their comprehension. When they attacked you, they were not fighting you, they were fighting the architect behind your destiny. And no created force outmaneuvers the creator of the blueprint. That is why the interference never fully penetrated. You may have felt pressure, yes. You may have sensed unusual heaviness, confusion that did not feel like your own thoughts, resistance in areas that previously flowed with ease. But notice something powerful: you did not collapse. You did not abandon your calling. You did not self-destruct in the way they anticipated. Something held you steady even when you could not articulate why you felt tested. That something was not luck. It was coverage. Divine protection is not fragile glass. It is an active system. It anticipates before you detect it, intercepts before you understand, and it recalibrates when something attempts to knock you off balance. Your assignments carry weight in the spiritual realm because they are connected to outcomes that ripple beyond your personal satisfaction. There are people tied to your obedience. There are generations connected to your union. There are opportunities dependent on your perseverance. And when destiny affects more than one life, the protection around it intensifies accordingly. They mistook your calm for vulnerability. They interpreted your focus as obliviousness. They thought because you were not reacting publicly, you were unaware. But protection does not require your constant awareness to function. The architect does not wait for your panic to begin defending what he has authored. There is something profound about being chosen for assignment. It means the resources backing you are proportionate to the mission ahead. That is why the attack was not just unethical, it was unwise. They targeted a structure supported by unseen reinforcements. They challenged a plan that was not subject to human veto. They attempted to manipulate outcomes that had already been sealed in higher courts long before their jealousy matured into action. When you understand this, you stop personalizing the attack as evidence that you are fragile. Instead, you see it as confirmation that you are significant. No one invests that level of energy into dismantling something insignificant. And yet significance does not mean vulnerability to defeat. It means activation of defense. The mistake was assuming they were contending with a human system. They were contending with divine infrastructure, and divine infrastructure does not crumble under coordinated resentment. It exposes it. As that realization settles, you begin to see why the backfire was inevitable. You cannot curse what God has blessed is not a slogan for comfort, it is a statement of structural reality. Blessing in this context is not surface-level favor, it is authorization. When something is authorized by heaven, it carries a seal that cannot be overwritten by unauthorized hands. They attempted to send out concentrated intention, believing that repetition and focus would amplify their influence. What they did not understand is that spiritual energy operates under return laws. Intention does not disappear into a void. It travels, it circulates, and it returns to its point of origin carrying the imprint of its motive. What they sent toward you encountered resistance not because you're untouchable as a human, but because what surrounds you filtered it. When filtered intention cannot land on its intended target, it does not evaporate, it rebounds. And like a boomerang traveling at multiplied velocity, it returns carrying its own distortion back to the sender. The backfire did not begin as fireworks. It began as subtle discomfort, a heaviness in their chest that logic could not soothe, a restlessness in the middle of the night that no distraction could silence, panic at hours when silence should bring rest, sleeplessness that feels like a conscience knocking from the inside. There is a distinct difference between random anxiety and the awareness that you crossed a line. The latter carries recognition. They feel it. They know it. There is a moment when arrogance dissolves and reality sets in, and that moment has arrived for them. Paranoia is not always delusion. Sometimes it is guilt anticipating consequence. They look over their shoulder not because someone is physically chasing them, but because internally they understand they activated something they cannot control. The universe does not operate on vendetta, it operates on balance. And balance demands correction when interference is deliberate. Divine judgment is not theatrical rage, it is order reasserting itself. They are discovering that protection around the chosen is not passive. It does not simply block and forget. It recalibrates and returns. Every intention aimed at dismantling you now circles back demanding settlement. And the settlement is not negotiable simply because regret appears later. Regret does not erase action. Remorse does not nullify energy already released. They are praying now because they feel the shift. They sense that what once felt like dominance now feels like exposure. Sleep becomes elusive because peace is tied to alignment, and they stepped out of alignment knowingly. Panic surfaces because control is slipping. When someone believes they're orchestrating outcomes and suddenly outcomes begin orchestrating them, fear takes root. That is the sense of we crossed a line that lingers in their spirit. It is not superstition, it is awareness of consequence. Meanwhile, you're being invited into a different posture. Not arrogance, not gloating, but understanding. Understanding that your protection is real. Understanding that delays you experience were not evidence of abandonment, but of buffering. Understanding that you do not have to carry residual fear that someone can secretly dismantle what heaven has approved. The backfire is not your responsibility to monitor. You do not need to track their discomfort or confirm their unraveling to validate your safety. Your focus remains forward because your assignment continues. The very fact that they are unsettled while you are stabilizing reveals the shift. What they attempted to reverse has instead reinforced your covering. What they tried to weaken has strengthened your discernment. You now sense energy shifts more clearly. You detect manipulation earlier. You move with a depth that only resistance can cultivate. The boomerang of their intention has returned, and in that return the lesson is etched into their experience. You cannot curse what God has blessed. You cannot dismantle what heaven has constructed. You cannot fight the architect and expect applause. And as their fear manifests in sleepless nights and quiet panic, you're stepping into clarity with confidence rooted not in ego but in divine alignment. As the consequences begin to surface in real and undeniable ways, what they are losing becomes impossible to ignore. And this is not about revenge or spectacle. It is about law unfolding across the very areas of life they thought they could manipulate without cost. When someone deliberately attacks what is divinely assigned, the correction rarely stays confined to one corner of their existence. It ripples outward, touching the structures they relied on for stability. You may not see every detail, and you do not need to, but there are tangible tremors shaking the foundations they once stood on confidently. Health, that fragile yet precious equilibrium they likely took for granted, begins to feel uncertain. Not necessarily dramatic, not theatrical, but subtle disruptions that cannot be explained away with convenience. Fatigue that lingers, stress that tightens the chest, a sense of internal imbalance that doctors might categorize as stress-related, while their spirit knows it is deeper than surface pressure. When you carry the weight of deliberate harm towards someone under protection, your nervous system does not rest easily. Guilt, fear, and the awareness of misalignment create internal strain, and strain over time manifests. Their body becomes the first courtroom responding to the imbalance they introduced into the spiritual realm. It is not punishment in the way human anger imagines punishment, it is consequence embodied. At the same time, financial stability, the very resource they may have invested into schemes believing they were buying influence, begins to erode. Deals fall through, opportunities evaporate, income streams fluctuate unpredictably. They may look at spreadsheets wondering how something that once flowed steadily now feels obstructed. Financial collapse does not always mean bankruptcy. Sometimes it means instability where there was once certainty, scarcity where there was once cushion. And scarcity breeds anxiety. They attempted to block your provision, to introduce pressure into your finances, believing that limitation would shrink your reach. Instead, limitation begins circling their own accounts. Money that could have been used to build, invest, and create becomes a reminder of what was wasted on envy. Relationship breakdowns follow closely behind because misaligned energy does not isolate itself. The same manipulation, secrecy, and control they directed outward begins corroding their closest bonds. Trust weakens, arguments intensify. Partners sense that something is off, even if they cannot articulate why. When someone operates from a place of intentional harm, that frequency seeps into their interactions. It is difficult to maintain intimacy while carrying concealed hostility. It is difficult to nurture love while harboring jealousy. And so connections that once appeared solid begin to fracture. Friends distance themselves. Alliances dissolve. The very circle that once fueled their coordination may now turn on itself, each person subtly blaming the other for the consequences unfolding. Permanent endings, though not always dramatic, occur in ways that feel final. Certain opportunities will not return. Certain reputations will not recover fully. Certain doors close quietly but definitively. And through all of it, the lesson is etched deeper into their reality. Attacking the anointed carries a cost that cannot be bargained away. There is no loophole large enough to step through once the law of return has been activated. You cannot negotiate with consequence by pretending ignorance after the fact. They were warned, they chose, and now they are experiencing. This is not meant to inflate your ego, it is meant to anchor your understanding. You're not protected because you're flawless. You're protected because you're assigned, and assignment is guarded. When you see or sense that something in their life is unraveling, resist the temptation to celebrate their discomfort. Instead, let it reinforce your awareness of the seriousness of spiritual law. Let it remind you that you too must operate with integrity, because the same universe that defends you also holds you accountable. As their losses accumulate across health, finances, relationships, and stability, clarity emerges about what they were really trying to stop in the first place. It was never just about irritation or petty dislike. It was about future. They saw something forming around you and they wanted it. They sensed a partnership approaching your life that carried weight beyond romance. They perceived a divine union not simply as emotional companionship, but as alignment of vision, resources, and impact. Your coming union is not ordinary attraction. It is a spiritual partnership. It is two individuals whose paths have been shaped separately for a convergence that amplifies both missions. Together your discernment sharpens. Together your capacity expands. Together your influence multiplies. That multiplication is what unsettled them. Because when two aligned people join under divine orchestration, generational wealth is not just financial inheritance, it is wisdom, passed down stability, established cycles, broken opportunities created for those who come after. A union like that becomes a catalyst. It funds missions, it builds structures, it inspires others to believe that alignment is possible. They could sense that your connection would not be contained to private happiness. It would ripple outward, helping many people in ways neither of you could fully see yet. And instead of positioning themselves to grow in their own lane, they chose to sabotage yours. Their strategy was subtle but calculated. They knew they could not directly dismantle what was ordained, so they attempted to sabotage your discernment. If they could not block the blessing, perhaps they could convince you to reject it. Introduce confusion. Plant doubt, whisper narratives that question timing, compatibility, worthiness, make you second-guess your intuition, make you interpret alignment as illusion. If you walked away voluntarily, they would not have to defeat destiny. They would simply watch you disqualify yourself. That was the plan, and this is where your strength became evident. You felt the fog at times, you experienced moments of questioning, but something in you refused to sever what felt divinely timed. Something in you recognized that fear did not originate from your higher self, that recognition is growth, that resistance to manipulation is maturity. They underestimated the spiritual muscles you developed through previous trials. They assumed you were still operating from insecurity. They did not realize that seasons of isolation, healing, and refinement had sharpened your inner compass. And so the very union they attempted to destabilize is now stronger because it has been tested by unseen resistance. When two people survive pressure, even if they were not consciously aware of the battle, the bond carries depth. Angels coordinate where humans cannot see. Ancestors align where logic cannot calculate. What they tried to fracture has instead been fortified. As the picture expands, it becomes clear that their attack was not one-dimensional. It was a three-front assault designed to destabilize you across practical, creative, and physical realms. They went after your finances first because money equals mobility. If they could delay deals, block opportunities, or create confusion around transactions, they believed pressure would accumulate. Perhaps someone owed you money and conveniently forgot. Perhaps a contract stalled without explanation. Perhaps income streams slowed unexpectedly. These are not always dramatic collapses, they're subtle constrictions. But notice something profound: even if flow slowed, it did not cease. You may have adjusted, you may have recalibrated, but you did not abandon your path. That alone dismantles their assumption that you are dependent on human provision. Your supply is connected to a source beyond manipulation. They then turn toward your creativity and purpose because they recognize that your voice carries influence. If you create, build, teach, speak, or innovate in any capacity, your output shifts atmospheres. They attempted to introduce creative blocks. Ideas that once flowed suddenly felt distant. Inspiration seemed delayed. You questioned whether your work still mattered. That questioning was not weakness, it was interference. They wanted you to feel average. They wanted you to silence yourself voluntarily. If you stopped expressing your assignment, they would not need to attack further. But even in seasons where your creativity felt slower, you did not quit. You rested perhaps, you restructured, you sought clarity, but you did not surrender your calling. That resilience is evidence of covering. Finally, they targeted your body and energy because if finances and creativity did not fully collapse, perhaps exhaustion would. Unexplained fatigue, disturbed sleep, a heaviness that felt disproportionate to your schedule. These experiences can feel confusing because they blur the line between spiritual resistance and natural stress. But here is what matters: even when you felt slowed, you did not stop. You may have moved through mud for a season, you may have needed more rest, you may have felt drained, yet you continued. You showed up imperfectly but consistently, and that consistency nullified their strategy. The three-front assault was designed to overwhelm you. Finances tightening, creativity dimming, body tiring. But you are still here, still building, still aligning, still believing. That is the most powerful testimony in this entire narrative. Because the emphasis is not on what they attempted, it is on what you refuse to abandon. You refuse to abandon your faith. You refuse to abandon your union. You refuse to abandon your purpose. And now, as their structures shake and your momentum rebuilds, this contrast is undeniable. They invested energy into dismantling you and ended up destabilizing themselves. You invested energy into growth despite resistance and ended up fortified. That is the difference between operating from envy and operating from assignment. And as you step forward, let this entire season refine you rather than harden you. Let it deepen your discernment without stealing your compassion. Let it confirm your protection without inflating your pride. Because the same law that defended you also calls you to integrity. And when you move with that awareness, nothing formed against you will prosper. Not because you're immune to challenge, but because you're aligned with something greater than manipulation, greater than jealousy, greater than fear. As the pressure intensifies on their side, their collapse does not remain contained within private discomfort. It spreads outward, revealing fractures that were always there but hidden under shared hostility. A group united by envy cannot sustain unity once consequence enters the room. Blame begins quietly at first, whispered in side conversations, subtle shifts in tone, glances that carry accusation. Then it grows louder. Who suggested this? Who pushed it further? Who assured everyone it would work? There is no honor among those who bonded over destruction. When outcomes sour, loyalty evaporates. The same people who once amplified each other's resentment now question each other's judgment. Chaos replaces coordination. The energy that once felt powerful in secrecy now feels unstable in exposure. And within that fracturing, one person feels it deeper than the others. There is always at least one who knew better, one who felt the warning internally, but followed the louder personality anyway. That person is wrestling with regret. They replay conversations in their mind. They remember the moment they could have walked away. They feel the weight of participating in something that targeted someone who was simply building their life. They want to confess. They want to reach out. They want to say, "You were right. We were wrong," but fear holds them still. Fear of rejection, fear of exposure, fear of admitting their own weakness. So they sit in silent remorse, carrying knowledge that could bring relief but lacking the courage to speak it. Meanwhile, mirror karma unfolds with unsettling precision. The very pain they attempted to engineer in your life begins appearing in theirs. If they try to fracture your relationships, theirs grow distant. If they try to strain your finances, unexpected expenses, or instability disrupt their sense of security. If they try to cloud your mind with doubt, confusion now visits them. This is not poetic coincidence, it is reflection. When you send out distortion, you eventually encounter it face to face. And at the center of this unraveling stands the ringleader, the one who initiated, who calculated, who convinced others that they were untouchable. Cold in presentation, strategic in approach, ego-driven in decision-making, this individual believed they understood the system well enough to bend it. They operated from arrogance disguised as confidence. They thought their previous manipulations proved immunity, but targeting someone under divine assignment shifted the scale. Now their unraveling is not subtle. Public shifts begin to occur, opportunities dissolve in ways others notice. Reputation trembles, the composed exterior cracks. People around them sense something off, even if they cannot articulate the source. Exposure is not always dramatic revelation. Sometimes it is the gradual unveiling of character through consequence. The ringleader who once appeared in control now faces visible instability. And this exposure is not just about embarrassment, it is about demonstration. It becomes a cautionary tale for anyone else considering interference with divine plans. As all of this unfolds externally, your focus shifts inward to what you do now, because being chosen does not mean becoming consumed with watching others fall. It means responding correctly to your own refinement. First, acknowledge that you were affected. Even if you did not have proof, your spirit felt something. There were moments when heaviness crept in without logical cause, when resistance felt disproportionate to effort. You're not imagining that. Sensitivity is not weakness, it is awareness. Honoring that awareness allows you to process without denial. But once acknowledged, release anger and confusion. Justice is handled. You do not need to carry bitterness as a souvenir from this season. Holding on to resentment binds you to a battle already resolved. Let it go, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer has authority. The universe has balanced what needed balancing. Your energy is too valuable to invest in replaying their mistakes. Keep building forward. The truest form of victory is not retaliation, it is thriving. Continue developing your craft. Continue nurturing your union. Continue expanding your vision. Every step you take in growth becomes silent testimony that interference failed. Step into acceleration with confidence. What felt delayed will return with momentum. Opportunities that seemed stalled may reappear aligned and amplified. Your discernment is sharper now because pressure refined it. You sense manipulation sooner. You trust your intuition deeper. That clarity is a gift earned through resistance. And over your union speak a decree of protection without arrogance but with conviction. What God has joined is not vulnerable to sabotage. No interference prospers against alignment rooted in divine timing. You do not need to defend constantly. You need to trust consistently. Now let me put you onto something real, because understanding the battle is one thing, but activating alignment intentionally is another. Tools exist to help chosen ones regain sovereignty after seasons of interference. Not superstition, not fear-based rituals, but intentional frameworks that recalibrate mindset, focus, and spiritual clarity. If you choose to integrate something practical, let it be something that restores your authority rather than feeds paranoia. A tool that reinforces alignment, strengthens discernment, and channels what was meant to break you into fuel for growth. Keep it simple. Engage with what empowers you to move forward, not what keeps you obsessing over what happened. Your responsibility is not to fight shadows, it is to expand in light. And as we close this chapter, seal it with understanding rather than emotion. They fought destiny and lost. Not because you're invincible as a human, but because destiny is not easily overturned. Re-anchor yourself in who you are. You're chosen not for vanity, but for assignment. You're protected not for comfort, but for purpose. You're positioned not randomly, but intentionally. Walk forward confidently. Do not shrink your presence because others misuse theirs. Love fully when your person arrives or deepens connection with you. Do not let past interference make you suspicious of blessing. Build fearlessly, create generously, let abundance flow without apology. The war is over. Their consequences are not your responsibility to monitor. What unfolds for them is between them and the laws they challenged. Your job is singular and clear. Thrive, evolve, and become everything you were always meant to be without hesitation.